Hello, everybody. Welcome to AZ Security. Today I have three guests, and we're going to talk about the Azure Local, a new technology which is very common used currently. Um, my name is Dylan Peijl. I am a cloud architect at IT Impressive, and today I have three guests. Darryl, can I start with you? Can you introduce yourself, please?
Of course. My name is Darryl van Peijl. I work and live in the Netherlands. I'm a CTO of SplitBrain. Um, we kind of focus a lot on Azure and Azure Local. Um, been doing so since the early days of Windows Server 2016 with Storage Space Direct. So been in the technology for a while. So I hope I can learn the audience something today.
Cool. Yannick, can I can you continue, please?
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. My name is Yannick de Koeijer. I'm currently a cloud solution architect at Microsoft. I've been so for the past almost 8 years, and I've been focusing on Azure Local, previously Azure Stack, for, I'd say, the past 7.5 years.
Wow, that's quite a long time indeed.
Back then,
Arnold,
it
can
was
you?
still Azure Stack Hub, and, you know, it slowly evolved.
True. Arnold, can you?
Yeah, and my name is Arnold van Wijnbergen. Yeah, as you hear of my name, I also live in the Netherlands. I'm also MVP, but not in the infrastructure space, more in the cloud security. I have a long background in Microsoft, started to work with it, especially in the Windows data center space, migrating Exchange. And I'm very curious about the security possibilities we have running local stacks using Azure Local and potentially using it to setting up a hybrid cloud or a multi-cloud solution.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's one of the use cases which I think Azure Local can be a key changer. Um, Yannick, can I ask you the technology for the audience? Can you explain in a few sentences what Azure Local is?
Yeah, so Azure Local is basically an extension of Azure on-premise. This will run on your own hardware. In the current iteration, it's quite flexible. You go to your favorite OEM, you say, I want an Azure Local, you buy an X amount of servers, you put them in your own data center, or you put them in an external data center, that doesn't really matter. It runs the Azure Local operating system, which is based on Windows Server with Hyper-V and Storage Spaces Direct, all integrated, and it comes out of the box as Azure Integrated. So you deploy it and you manage it from the Azure portal. So you have the strength of the hardware and your data running on-prem and the management running from Azure.
Cool. And are there specific use cases what you're seeing where Azure Local is being used very often?
Yeah, absolutely. We've identified a couple of major topics. Legacy is a big one. Some virtual machines, for instance, or some workloads might not run in the cloud or they might not run fully in the cloud. So you want to keep these on prem. Another big one is latency. So in manufacturing plants, for instance, you might need a very low latency, and having to connect to the cloud and back might be too slow. For instance, if you have sensors in your manufacturing process and you need like sub 1 or sub 2 milliseconds of latency, you want the data and the processing really close to your plant itself.
Okay.
Then, of
Yeah.
course, another big one is data sovereignty. Having full control of your data in whatever country or location that you want.
Yeah, I think
Can I can I
sovereign.
throw another one in there?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. I was thinking about performance as well. So obviously you buy the hardware, so you can choose what hardware components you choose. Um, you can make them as fast as you want, obviously. So you can make use of the latest storage technologies or memory technologies, or even GPU technologies. So you buy the hardware on CAPEX, or you do a leasing model. You can run as many compute power as you want on those machines, right? So you don't have any things to think about costs that you're normally running in the public Azure cloud. You're now running on-prem on your own hardware without someone sending you a bill afterwards for your usage. So performance is a big one as well, I think.
Yeah, I can imagine that. But what are the costs besides the hardware that you have to buy yourself, of course? Are there specific costs that you are still responsible, or that Azure, how do you say that, offer you?
Yeah, there is a licensing model on Azure Local, of course. The licensing is built by physical CPU core per month. So depending on how many cores you have, that's the billing that goes through the Azure portal itself. You can also choose to use software assurance with hyperuse benefits, and then you can use existing licenses you might already have. And something that's new is OEM licenses. So when you buy the hardware from the OEM, you can also include OEM licenses for Azure Local.
Okay, okay.
Okay. So Yannick, you mentioned that it's running on Windows, so it's running Hyper-V.
Hyper-V based, Windows Server based, yes.
Yeah. So about if you're running, let's say, workloads on Linux or AKS, can you also deploy them on, for example, on your local Azure
Absolutely.
Local?
Absolutely. We have customers that run zero Windows Server virtual machines on these environments. They run full on Linux, they run full on AKS, Azure Kubernetes Services. Absolutely possible. There's a little, I'd say, little cheat. You just look at what is supported in the Hyper-V support list, and that's
Yeah.
supported by Azure Local.
Oh,
So
that's
when
great.
it comes
Because
to
that
virtual
really
machines,
helps.
because of course in the background it's Hyper-V, so if it's Hyper-V supported, it's Azure Local supported. Sort of, yeah.
That's
Yeah.
a good tip. Yeah.
Yeah. So a
Yes.
customer can really, let's say, choose where to run his workload, and he can make a cluster, let's say, on premise where his data lives, maybe connect to its own HSM, for example, and
Yeah.
can also have a workload running on the AKS in Azure. What I don't think.
Yeah,
So,
there are some limitations to HSMs in Azure Local itself.
okay.
You cannot just go ahead and plug in everything. We are working on a wider support of different types of HSMs. Of course, we have the Azure Key Vault, which that's our own product, obviously, that runs with the Azure Local. And in the future product, the Azure Local Disconnect, we're going to have Key Vault running on-prem on the Azure Local itself as well.
Okay.
And to revert to what you said, run what you want on whatever environment you want. Also, something that Darryl said. If you have virtual machines that might need a lot of GPU power, you might be better off running these on your Azure Local because it's more efficient from a cost and management perspective to run them on your Azure Local, and then have other VMs that don't need a GPU that they can run in the Azure cloud, for instance. So you can really balance where will I get the most value for my money.
So hybrid,
Yeah.
it's not a problem at all. I just hear in your sentences.
You cannot go and just move those virtual machines around all nilly-willy. Of course, you can use Azure Migrate or Azure Backup Services to say, I've got a VM running on Azure Local, I want to move that to the cloud. Sure, fully supported. But it's not meant as a platform to send VMs back and forth all the time. So
Okay.
you have to choose beforehand. But often with these workloads, you can say we have GPU-enabled workloads. Let's take AVD as an example, Azure Virtual Desktop. You can give your users access to AVD in Azure, Public Azure, or on Azure Local. To them, it looks and feels the same. They get a portal, they can connect to a virtual machine. That's it.
Right.
But the AVD session in Azure might be a simple one, and the AVD session on Azure Local might be GPU enabled. So on that environment, they can use heavy cat software, for instance.
Yeah. Yeah. True.
I think we also always have the difficulty of networking. Like if you combine a local data center with the data center of Microsoft, you don't have layer two networking. And so maybe a little bit technical, but you cannot move VMs around and keep the same IP addresses, right? So you have maybe
Yeah.
an express route or a VPN connection, and you always have to go to a process which is called IP readdressing or something like that in English.
Yeah.
So you have to change the IP address of the machine if you fail it over. And yeah, that's difficulty with moving VMs back and forth from on-prem to public cloud and back. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, but you can move workloads from AKS cluster A to AKS cluster B. Huh? So
Yes.
that's things what can happen.
Yeah.
So, for
Yeah. So
example, if they two application clusters work together. One is the, let's say, the bigger cluster on-premise with the high secure data. It's running workloads. You have a cluster in the cloud, which is customer facing, which is only contacting the other cluster. So that really will help
Yeah,
in some cases if data sovereignty is a problem for certain data that is stored. So
yep,
yeah,
definitely. So I think if you do the networking right, you can make use of load balancing. So, for example, I have built my Azure Local cluster, which is running AKS behind an Azure App Gateway. So it routes all the traffic coming from Azure to load balancers or to Traffic Manager or whatever. It routes it all the way back to your on-premise environment without the end user knowing it. So it can land on your sovereign data center or getting your sovereign data somewhere locally. So yeah, it's all magically happens.
Yeah,
great,
for the,
great.
It's the magic of Azure Local.
yeah. Well,
We
it's
keep it
great
local.
for the users. I mean, they mustn't be bothered where it's running.
Yeah.
Yannick, you mentioned data sovereignty. If you're looking like that, and you mentioned the disconnected version, what does that mean, disconnected? Is it really, as the name suggested, disconnected, or does it have a time span of days? Can you tell me a little bit more about that feature?
Absolutely. So in the current Azure Local version, there's not a full disconnected scenario. So currently, if you have an Azure Local running and for whatever reason it disconnects, let's say someone accidentally puts a digging machine through your fiber and your connection to the outside world is disconnected. Okay, your Azure Local will be running. Containers and virtual machines that are running on the platform will continue running. Um, as you mentioned, after 30 days, the Azure Local will say, okay, I have now not been in contact with Azure Public for 30 days. I'm going to unregister myself. The
Okay.
Azure Local then disconnects from Azure Public because it simply couldn't connect to it for a month. So it just assumes it's gone. The virtual machines and containers that run on it, however, will continue to run because they don't necessarily rely on the Azure Public infrastructure because all the infrastructure is running on-prem. The only things that you will miss, of course, are maybe integrations that you have made with the Azure platform. If you are leveraging policies or Defender, other security settings that come from the Azure portal, yeah, you will miss those because it simply cannot talk to it.
Yeah,
That's the current state in the current Azure Local.
Okay.
If you look at the future, hopefully around the end of year, Ignite will get some more announcements. We'll be looking at Azure Local Disconnected, which is a new version which will be really disconnected. It will not leverage the Azure Public as the current Azure Local does. So things like identity, key vault, they run on the Azure Local itself instead of in Azure Public. So then we won't have the limitation of 30 days anymore. That Azure Local can really run disconnected. Of
Okay.
course, minus some services that need to come from the Azure Public environment. You cannot leverage Azure monitoring if it doesn't connect to the internet. Like if it doesn't connect to Azure, you cannot use the monitoring. But it also means that some other services might not work. So there will be a balance between what do you need and what is your ideal scenario and what features can you miss.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I've heard a scenario like, what if we have a data loss connection around a few months, and it unregisters itself? How does it register itself? Is that even possible, or do we have to redo the setup again? And I said, like, well, that is a good question to ask tonight. What if we now exceed the 30 days? The future is coming. But what if we triple around that 30 days?
Yeah.
What happens then?
So if you disconnect for an entire quarter, well, it's possible. You might want to ask yourself, if you know this is going to happen often, why are you leveraging this technology? Do you need the services from the Azure Public Cloud? Like, what are you actually using, and what made you choose the product in the first place? If you're going to go to an area where there's no connectivity at all, because keep in mind, if you have a simple 5G, 4G connection through a mobile SIM card, or maybe through a satellite connectivity. It doesn't need much. It just needs to say, "Hi, I'm alive."
Just
That's it.
heartbeat.
Yeah. So we have customers that run offshore, for instance. They run either on satellite or on 4 5G routers. They might not be connected every day either, but they will connect once every couple of days or maybe once a day to at least have that connectivity back and forth, maybe pull in some new policies, or maybe just to connect and say, "Oh, hi, I am a 40 core cluster. Please don't forget to send me a bill at the end of the month." The
Yeah,
customer
so
might
these
not
are
find it
really the
important, but
parts. So these are really the parts that are, let's say, sending the data. So the customer data is still there. It's not lost. So your data is
correct.
still there. It's your
Yeah.
application. It requires the management data.
Yes.
And the question what you mentioned, it will be, let's say, so locally managed, but it will never be, let's say, air gapped, because
Yeah.
some people ask, can it be air gapped? And what I now feel, it's not becoming an air gapped solution. That it's
Not in the
totally
current version, no.
not in the current version.
But it will be something we'll be looking at in the next version, the real
Okay.
Azure Local disconnected. But the current version is not meant for that. Because Azure Local is an extension of Azure Public. So it's also about the services that come from Azure Public. If you're going to go air gapped, you cannot reach those services. So why are you doing it?
Yeah.
And also I think that now there's no way to update the Azure Local environment. So the solution has not built that in yet. And I want to add two more details to the story of Yannick.
Of course.
Is sorry, Yannick. One, you can still use local tooling. So if you lose connectivity to the Azure public environment, you can still use local tooling to create VMs, shut them down, add disks, anything you need to do, right? That's within the 30 days. After the 30 days, I think you're unable to create any new VMs, but you can still manage your current VMs.
Okay.
So the OS will block you from creating any new instances of virtual machines. And it's just because Microsoft cannot see what you're using, cannot bill you for your usage, and needs a way to trigger you to connect again, right?
Yeah.
So that's two points I wanted to add.
Yeah.
But Darryl, if for some reason, I mean, I don't know current use cases, but I can imagine if you put Azure on board in a submarine, you can be a long time disconnected maybe as well. Is there a possibility to reactivate it if the 30 days are hit? Or is it just game over? You can only use what you have running and that's it?
Microsoft?
Yeah. It's not a button. It's not a button you can push and say, "Oh, I'm back, re-register."
Okay.
If you really dive into it, you can re-register, but it's not the simplest task. Let's call it that way.
Okay.
We might see improvement in that in the future, but that will probably come around the same time as Azure Local disconnected. So then it's not an issue anymore. But we'll get a feature called rehydration, which will also help with moving resources around, and probably it will also help with readopting resources that were disconnected. But that's just me looking at my crystal ball right now. That's not been confirmed.
Okay. Okay. Well, that's good to know at least. If you're looking to the Azure stack, I saw also identity possibility, like creating your own sort of local Active Directory or something like that. And you can connect your local AD in that matter. How does that work with Entra? Is there a sync element there? If you, for instance, choose to send your identities synced to Entra with your local Active Directory? Do you?
So let's sketch the picture, right? You've got a local AD, and currently that is still required for Azure Local, but that's a requirement that will be dropped in the future. But you have a local AD, you've got local identities, and you have Azure Entra Sync. So
Yeah.
those local identities, they will sync with Entra ID. From that point, you can use those Entra ID identities to use role-based access control, for instance,
Mhm.
on the Azure Local environment.
Okay, so that's just working you're not bound to the local AD, if you say
No.
so.
No. So the local AD currently is used for the Azure Local cluster itself. So that's for the cluster to be aware what it is, where it is, and where to fail over to in case it loses one of the nodes, for instance. But it's not required for the rest of the process that runs on top of it.
No,
Yeah.
no.
So you can see it as a management domain and not a user domain.
Yeah, very simply put, yes. And I've said it really simply because in the near future, this requirement will be taken out as well.
Yeah.
So it's something that we see in the current environment, but it's really only for the Azure Local itself, for the nodes, for the cluster, and for the deployment, of course.
Yeah. And if we look at the future, what you mean, if you can run it, let's say you have this disconnected operations feature coming, and you want to run, and for example, identities, and you will get rid of AD. And does this mean that you also will have a sort of copy Entra ID locally running?
No, it won't be running a local Entra ID. It will leverage a lot of Key Vault for the local identities.
Okay, so there is because if you are so then in the key vault you can only create, let's say, the secrets, the certificates, but where do you manage the users then if it's running, let's say, disconnected?
Yeah, so let's ask the question: if you're gonna run an Azure Local disconnected, there's no way to connect to Entra ID
Yeah.
because it's air gapped or whatever. There's a block in the network towards this environment. So there will always be a limitation, and we're going to have to work with the limitation that we have at that moment. And looking at it right now, using Key Vault is probably the best way, not only to store your secrets and your identities, but also for the virtual machines that run on top of it, for all the workloads that run on top of it to be stored in a safe environment.
Yeah, okay. So it's the user objects, let's say the user should then be created in a local store. Still looking a little bit if it's disconnected operations and you're off for a period of
Yeah.
time and you want to log in with a user still somewhere, then how does it handle that authentication flow, especially when AD goes away locally? So that was one of my questions that just popped up my mind.
Well, you can still run an AD locally, and you can still leverage your local AD for your virtual machines that run on top of it. So let's
Okay.
say when you've deployed your Azure Local that no longer requires an AD to function on its own, you can still have virtual machines on top of it that have joined, let's use the Contoso domain,
Yeah.
but your Azure Local doesn't need to be part of that. So right now I'm running an Azure Local, let's say in contoso.com domain, and the virtual machines that run on top of it might run in, I don't know, my Yannick domain. They don't even have to be connected. It doesn't matter.
Yeah. Okay. I know, but indeed, it's so you can't use, let's say, Entra services in the
Yeah,
disconnected
so
operation.
let's be very clear, right? So for user credentials and that sort of stuff, we don't have any local Entra ID instance going to be running, right? So it's going to be Azure, or it's going to be Active Directory locally,
Yeah.
or another identity provider if you have one. But I think Active Directory is the number one choice, right? Locally,
On-premise, yeah, mostly.
on-prem. Yeah, but it also means that you do not get the nice things from Entra ID if you're running Azure Local disconnected. So you don't get the MFA stuff, you don't get all the policy stuff. So you're going, let's say, back to basic with Active Directory.
I
Um,
had the same thought.
but
That's the reason why I ask, because
Yeah.
but you're
indeed,
fully air gapped, right? So
yeah,
it
if you're fully air gapped, indeed.
Yeah. And most of the customers won't be fully air gapped. So a lot of customers also say, oh, we need to run disconnected. But when you continue questioning what do you exactly mean, it just turns out that they want their storage and their data to be on-prem. And it's perfectly fine to have the environment connected to the Azure portal. for management and other operations, as long as the data stays on-prem. So that's something that, I mean, every one of us should be very mindful of, is ask, ask, ask. What exactly do you mean with I'm not allowed to connect or I'm not allowed to be online? What exactly do you mean? And of course, there is valid use cases where you have to be air gapped, absolutely. And for that small amount of customers, we're going to bring Azure Local Disconnected. But those customers often are already running air gaps, so they are fully aware of limitations that they currently also have.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I hear
Yeah.
what you're saying.
Yeah.
It's just that we want to understand what the limitations are basically from the disconnected, and how
Yeah, of
Microsoft
course.
is positioning it basically. But talking about it, do you have maybe a demo to get a glance in how Azure Local is viewed, or how it looks like?
Yeah, I think both Darryl and myself can take you on a small journey through the portal and show you what Azure Local looks like compared to Azure Public, but also with all the features and functionalities.
Cool. Then I would say take it away.
So, like we mentioned earlier, Azure Local is your own hardware platform with the Azure Local operating system on top of it, which is then connected to Azure Public. That connection is done by the Azure Arc Resource Bridge. So with the Azure Arc Resource Bridge, it enables ARM, Azure Resource Manager, to talk to your local environment in an Azure native way. So because we have the Azure native approach with ARM, we can leverage the Azure Public Services. So here on the screen, you see some of these services shared. Some of these are in preview at the moment, but a lot of these are GA. So looking at, for example, Azure Arc enabled SQL Server. This will be delivered as a service on your Azure Local on-prem. So we as Microsoft will manage that environment for you. It comes as a container, so it lands on your AKS platform in Azure Local. We manage that container for you, and you get the benefits of a SaaS solution. With that, if you go from left to right on the slide, you see, of course, on the left, you see the IaaS, the virtual machines, Linux, Windows, variety of different flavors you can run. Azure Virtual Desktop as a service, you deploy it in the same way as you do in the Azure portal. The only difference is that you say you want it to land on Azure Local. Looking into that, delving deeper, you can see other services like the Azure IoT operations and more machine learning services that also land as containers on your Azure Local environment. Looking at the top of the slide, you see some other integrations. These actually come from the Azure Public Cloud. So looking at identity, defender, monitoring, these are all services that run in Azure Public. They are just connected to Azure Local. So these do not run on Azure Local itself. It just communicates with the Azure Public interface and then leverage these tools. So your monitoring metrics, they are uploaded to Azure to your Log Analytics workspace. Your user and customer data will stay on-prem. That doesn't get sent over. And that's what we do with the entire platform.
Right. I think one great thing to add is, so AVD, Azure Virtual Desktop, is running session hosts on-prem, so on your Azure Local instance.
Yeah.
But actually the broker is running in Azure. So you always connect through Azure to the session host. And as soon as that connection is set up, it will do a direct connection with your client to session host over UDP.
Yeah. So it can use this RDP short path for low latency, of course, after it's set up that connection. And that will probably tie into the next question that comes. What if I lose connection? Sessions that are currently running will remain running because they run locally, but you won't be able to set up a new session because you cannot connect to the session broker.
Right. Yeah. Clear.
All right. Then now let me take you through a quick demo of the Azure portal. Let's see if that's working. Yes. So the Azure portal, you probably have seen this if you're watching this video. And so in Azure portal, you have the Azure Local service that you can click on. And here you can see in the overview pane all your clusters and details of your clusters. So for example, I have some cluster need attention. I have 4 connected. 1 is not connected recently, so probably been away for a long time. I can see my update status. If I go to the other pane, I can actually see the cluster that I have running. So I have 5 clusters running. And let's go at this split brain cluster 01. So you can see this is my Azure Local instance. The location is West Europe. So that's the ARM location, so the Azure site location. But you can actually see that it has a custom location as well, which is called SB location. In other words, split brain location. It has been connected 8 minutes ago. If I scroll down a little bit, you can actually see what hardware I have underneath this cluster. So I have some Dell nodes, which are the Apex MC 660s, my physical cores. We spoke about the licensing model, so we pay per core, right? So this is also ties to your billing.
Yeah, and let's repeat this. It's per physical core. We do not count hyperthreading.
Yep. And also do not count virtual cores. So if you have VMs, those are not counted as well. So you can run limited virtual cores as long as your physical cores allows it, obviously.
Okay.
I have an up-to-date system, which is unique. And then if you go to infrastructure, you can look at my machines. So I have 2 nodes, split brain node 1, split brain node 2. These are actually ARC-enabled physical machines. So you can drill into them. You can do all these stuff that you can do with a physical machine. So, attach policies, do a run command, do the Azure Update Manager stuff, everything you're used to. Then going back to Azure Local. Then here you can see the resources drop down. So you can have all types of resources in here. It's focused on IaaS and PaaS in this view. So we got some virtual machines. We got a machine running. Let's just do a quick deployment, just because we can.
It may be good to give some extra information while you click through this page. Where in Azure Public you are tied to different t-shirt sizes, let's call them that, D-series VMs, M-series VMs. That's not a limitation you have on Azure Local. So on Azure Local, it's maybe more the classic way, where you can select the amount of cores and select the amount of memory you want to allocate to your virtual machine. This gives even greater flexibility and optimization for your entire platform, because you can really, like beforehand, if you know what your workload is, it's going to be very memory intensive, for instance, you can really optimize that for that specific workload or that specific workload type. You can see that right now where Darryl is clicking in the bottom of the screen. 4 cores and 8 gigs of memory. You can adjust that however you like.
Yeah, I also saw the security type, which is very
I was
awesome.
waiting. Yeah, I was waiting for you, Dinant, because I was, Yannick was talking. But yeah, so we also got the ability to do trusted launch VMs indeed. Yeah, so we can use a virtual TPM to actually launch a trusted virtual machine. So that's cool.
It's a very awesome feature, and indeed.
All right, I will want to click through this because I want to show you something at the end.
Yeah. So here you also see domain join. You can automatically join this VM to a domain, but you don't need to.
And this is based on the VM extensions that we're used to in Azure as well, Public Azure. And so this is the same technology. I can add some data disk if I want. I can add a network interface. Actually, it's mandatory to do so. So I will add one. Select the network. So these are my on-premises VLANs. Click add. Next. We'll not use a tag for now. And so the thing I wanted to show is, so this is the overview of the VM I'm creating. You can download the template for automation, right? So if we're drilling into the automation template, which is actually an ARM template, you can start to see on how you can deploy this VM. So it makes use of a specific resource provider, Microsoft Hybrid Compute.
Hybrid Compute, yeah.
And it also uses some, extended location. So this is my custom location. And this is the way how ARM knows I'm deploying a VM and it needs to land on the split brain cluster instead of my West Europe environment, right? And this is also where many of my customers are getting very happy because they now can integrate infrastructure as code and pipelines into the deployment of VMs deploying locally, right? So imagine if you have, I don't know, 25 locations worldwide, you can now deploy with one single click 25 VMs to each, one VM to each location, so 25 in total, right? So the automation is very powerful. And this is the cloud that you're using.
And not just the at-scale deployment, this also ties into your maybe deployment pipelines for developers. If they quickly need to deploy a VM for testing purposes, they say, click, deploy a VM. I think, Darryl, you once made a really nice example where you go through a Microsoft Forms. You just fill out your name, you say what you want, and you submit your Microsoft Forms, and 5 minutes later, there was a VM running on an Azure Local environment. And of
Yeah.
course, with policies, you can then say, oh, delete it after a couple of days again. So really powerful stuff.
Indeed. Looking to the portal, which you mentioned, nowadays there is a possibility to click on Bicep as an extraction or Terraform. Will that come in the future also? We now only saw ARM in the current portal.
Probably, but I think with Visual Studio Code, you can easily convert it from ARM to Bicep, right?
True.
So I think there are already Bicep templates on GitHub in the official repository, but I have not seen it here yet. But I'm pretty sure they're working on it. Yeah.
Okay.
I know there is an unofficial Terraform integration as well, and I know there's been some work on an official Terraform integration, but I don't know the status of that one.
Right, the same process we can do for a Kubernetes cluster. So you can deploy one from the portal, but you can also do it through a ARM template or Bicep or API calling.
And I think the good thing to mention is if you click here on create an AKS cluster, it will look the same as if you would create one from the Azure portal for Azure Public. So also for your management team, your IT team, it won't be such a massive shock, and it will be a similar interface. It will be similar deployment types. But that's very useful for them as well.
Yeah, so you really can use, let's say, the AKS Fleet Manager to manage the whole fleet of AKS clusters.
Yep.
And get the unified experience. You can also use, for example, nowadays the Defender, so Microsoft Defender for cloud on both environments.
Yep, that and all the integration is there indeed. So you can also use GitOps. With this case, we use Flux to automatically deploy stuff to the Kubernetes cluster. So okay, and then you got all the on-prem logical networks and disk and VM images. But I really want to go to the security defaults, as we are on a security podcast, right? So
yeah. I'm happy that you're clicking on that.
So I think Microsoft is doing a great job in making the virtualization platforms more secure, right? And I would be lying if they were doing it for Windows Server only. So they're probably doing it for Azure a lot, and it's all running the same hypervisor with basically the same OS. And there's a lot of stuff that they have developed for the Azure Local system as well. So all these settings are enabled by default. I think we can even click on it.
Yeah, so during the deployment of your cluster, one of the questions will be, hey, what security settings do you want to have enabled? And by default, it will give a list of these. And then there's a couple of extras you can also toggle on or off.
I've seen them in action, but I'm happy that Darryl just showed it in this use case.
Yeah.
So.
Right. One other great thing is the application control. So by default, every application is blocked on Azure Local OS. So nobody can tamper with your OS or install any software. You can create a policy. For example, if you have your own monitoring agent or your backup vendor that you want to have as an agent on your machine, you can create a policy for that. As you can see now, I'm out of policy because I did not have this control enforced. But so this way you can keep your systems in check. And so just keep in mind that, let's say, if you have 25 clusters running worldwide, with one configuration change, like an Azure policy or something, you can change every application control or security default setting on every cluster, right? So this is the power of the cloud that you can use in your data center.
And of course, at the same time, these things will also show up in your other dashboards. So your security dashboards, your monitoring dashboards. Uh, you can attach triggers to this as well.
All right.
You have still one pane of glass to look
Exactly.
at. Yeah.
And then obviously, monitoring. Oh, go ahead.
I was also triggered what you mentioned, Yannick, like the SQL offering, which is also being provided into containers.
Mhm.
And that makes it very easy, of course, to deploy it instead of having a big data cluster,
Yeah.
a SQL cluster, sorry, being provisioned. You can run it in a container, which is maintained then, of course, by Microsoft.
Yeah.
So that is also a very nice add-on.
Yeah, it's
just
very
thought
easy for developers as well, right? If
Yes,
they quickly need to spin something up, you spin up a container with a SQL instance. You're not spinning up entire estates anymore. So it gives you a lot more flexibility.
indeed. And those images are maintained by Microsoft, so that is a plus again.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. Yeah. So the cluster is automatically onboarded in Azure Monitor, so you get all the insights and metrics out of the box. So just the typical stuff. So how much memory is used on the physical machines, the latency of the physical disks, errors, CPU, and we scroll all the way down. So this is all the stuff you can get, and you can make your own policies and alerting on these metrics as well. Not much happening on this cluster I see now. Let's see if we can get some.
That's no problem. I mean, it's good to have a visual where you can find the metrics.
Yeah. I mean, this is, of course, a demo cluster. So,
Indeed, yeah.
And it has just been started before recording this podcast, so.
we should put it to work.
No problem, no problem. Thanks.
Right. Yeah, I think this was the overview of the Azure Local in the Azure portal. Anything I'm forgetting, Yannick?
I think maybe really nice to quickly do the VM images. Because if you're going to deploy virtual machines in Azure, you're going to be able to choose between Azure Marketplace VMs, or you're going to be able to choose your own uploaded or custom VMs. You can do the same on Azure Local. So from here, if you click on the Add VM image, you can see, oh, I want an image from the Azure Marketplace, and it will sync that image from the Azure Marketplace to your Azure Local. So it won't be talking to the Azure Public portal every single time if you're going to deploy 100 VMs. You can locally cache one of these images, and they will update just the same. So if there's a new version, it will show on your update pane and say, hey, I've got a new version of this image. You can sync it with your Azure Local. It will be stored on your Azure Local. And every time you deploy a VM and you select this image, it will use the locally cached image. Which also means you can use Windows Server Azure Edition. So especially in 2022, there's some extra features in there. 2025, we've made that more unison with the other versions as well. But there's still some features that are in the Azure Edition specifically that are not in normal edition. And that's something you'll only find in Azure and on Azure Local.
I think the same goes for Windows 11 with multi-session, right?
Yeah.
So Windows 11 is on AVD, you can use multi-session image, which means multiple users can log into the same machine. You cannot use that anywhere outside of Public Azure, but now you can use it on Azure Local as well. So you can get the multi-session version and use that on Azure Local for multi-session session host.
Yeah. And if you go back, you also saw that you can upload your own images, right? So if you have your own custom images built, you can upload them just as easy here from your Azure Storage account or from a local share.
Nice. Yeah. That answers my question. Like, if I had to create a hardened image, which I did in public, how do I get it over to local? But here is the answer. Thanks.
Yeah, here it is. Yeah, so you've got that flexibility of using your own images, but also like the ease of use of having the marketplace images that are already pre-built or that you might already leverage in Public Azure itself.
True. Yeah. Well, thank you for the amazing demonstration for your demo. also quickly launched. Thank you for that. Thank you for that.
No worries.
I think we get a good glance in what it is, what the possibilities are currently, but also, as Yannick has explained, the things are coming. So I'm very happy that you guys had the time for today to talk about this beautiful topic. And
Thank you for having us.
yeah, I'm very pleased. So thank you very much. Arnold, do you have another question, maybe, or?
No, really, I like the demo, managing the VMs, that all the products are, let's say, integrated, like the Defender. So
Yeah.
Microsoft Defender for Cloud, really like that, monitoring Azure Monitor. And I really got my answer. So thanks, Yannick and Darryl, for it.
Great. Maybe to add for closing is, I want to start with Azure Local, where to start, right?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah. That was my last question, but always
oh,
great.
sorry.
No
Sorry.
problem.
It's a
We're
good
on the
intro.
same vibe. That's good.
I was scared you was going to close down if you're without telling us. But I think Microsoft does a decent job in the documentation for getting started with Azure Local. So, learn.microsoft.com is a good place to start. We also got the jump box, which has been renamed.
Azure Arc Jump Box. I think
Yeah.
it's still called Azure Arc Jump Box.
That's the way to deploy a virtual cluster to public Azure. Right? And you can use the Azure as your hoster, and you can play around with Azure Local. I have a newsletter on LinkedIn, which is fun to read, I guess, which I get sent out sometimes monthly, sometimes a little bit longer. But
Whenever there is a big update.
it contains the latest and greatest.
Cool.
And otherwise, call Yannick and myself, I guess.
I will add the links on this video so that everybody can click on your newspaper, and I also will add some other links as well, which we have discussed in this talk. So great, thank you very much.
I have to say the link I just said was wrong. Just go to your favorite search engine and type in Azure Arc Jump Box or Azure Arc Jump Start, and you will find it. A great project. There's not just Azure Local sandbox environments, but also other Arc templates you can just deploy. Keep in mind, when you turn it on, it runs nested in Azure, so it will run in your subscription. Be mindful of information that's given, of warnings that are given. Look at the price. Make sure you turn it off when you're done. That's all I'm going to say. And like Darryl said, reach out to any of us if you have questions. We're always happy to help.
All right, let's round up. Thanks, guys, everybody. Thanks for listening. If you're listening later on, and hopefully till next time. Take care. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Thanks. Bye bye.